Alright guys, so here's our new iPhone 11 Pro camera review, and this one might be a little different than all the other reviewers talking about how great the camera is, when in fact we have some beef with it. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to Monkey Pixel.
We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
1, 2, 3, listen.
Yes, I know, we're talking about phone cameras here, and obviously what a camera in a phone can do these days is amazing, and the photos you can get out of it are incredible when everything applied is right. And I probably wouldn't even have done this video in the first place if Apple wouldn't have done one thing, and that is call the device Pro. And before we start the review, let's get two things out of the way. Number one, I've been in this industry, I've been a working photographer for 12 years, also a full-time filmmaker, so yes, I would consider myself a pro. And second, no, I'm not a Samsung or Android fanboy. Actually, since the iPhone 1 came out, I haven't owned a other phone than the iPhone for the past 11 years. And a lot of people actually call me an Apple fanboy. So this is definitely not the angle I'm coming from, and I love all the Apple products, but I'm the first one to admit when something isn't right. So you might have seen our model shoot Monday on Monday, obviously, when we shot an entire shoot just with the iPhone 11 Pro, video as well as photo, and we cherry picked the best pictures out of it, and honestly the results we got were amazing on the video side as well as on the photography side. If you haven't watched this, you can watch it right here and then come back to the review, because now we're talking about the bad sides. But wait, before we talk about the bad sides, let's get the good sides out of the way. The one thing that got me excited the most is that now the 28mm wide angle lens actually has the feature to shoot portraits, meaning that you can fake a bokeh. And the second thing that got me really excited is obviously the ultra wide angle. Because this is something really convenient to have if you're just out on vacation, if you're just walking around and you want to get a little bit more in your frame. That is a really cool feature to have, and I've been waiting for this for years on the iPhone. What's also new is the new night mode, which I really wasn't too excited about. We tested it out. All it does is actually give you the option to expose a little longer, and giving you the option isn't really 100% right, because whatever you kind of want to do, the iPhone does it for you. It doesn't really work too often when it's not completely dark outside and you don't really have any control over it in the beginning. So that is taken with a grain of salt, and still the sensor on the iPhone is still too small to really compete against other cameras when you want to take night photography shots. But it's definitely a good step into the right direction, so I'm not even going to comment on that for too long. And why is that? Because we're mostly shooting portraits, we're shooting people, and that if you expose too long, it's really not that great for shooting people because you get a lot of blur into your pictures. So about a year ago, when the iPhone XS Max came out, we already did a comparison video between the Canon 1DX Mark II and the iPhone XS. And the results were pretty amazing. But one thing that I really didn't like about the camera was that the bokeh function, the portrait mode, only worked on the telelens, which was the around 50mm equivalent. And it was really limited. You also had to go back and forth a lot because the framing was really limited by the software when it actually worked. And honestly, most of our shoots are done at around 35mm equivalent, because I kind of like adding a lot of context into the picture when taking portraits. And that just wasn't possible with the earlier iPhone models. But now that the 28mm version actually has the ability to shoot portraits, that's obviously something exciting for me. Also, I always felt that the 50mm just was so much less quality than the 28mm in general. So other than the portrait function, I rarely used the 50mm on the earlier iPhones at all. So throughout our testing, we didn't do what most other reviewers did, and that is just taking the regular camera, because let's face it, it's pretty amazing. And if you're just walking around taking shots of your surroundings, This is really good, and there's probably not even a point to be made to carrying a bigger camera around if you're just doing snapshots for your Instagram stories or even your Instagram feed when using the regular camera. But what we do 95% of the time is shooting portraits. I'm shooting portraits of Belle, I'm shooting portraits of other girls, Belle is shooting portraits of me. So for our Instagram story and basically just our social media, we're always taking a camera with us to be able to shoot pictures wherever we go. And with the new iPhone 11 Pro, we kind of hope that maybe we can actually leave the bigger camera at home, because this is probably sufficient for most of these situations. Plus, a really big advantage of the new iPhone, or any iPhone in general, is that you can take pictures where your big camera would draw a lot of attention. So for example, in summer we've been to Barcelona, and we've been to Barcelona a lot, and I really don't like taking my camera to the beach because crime rate is so high and people just pickpocket your camera from wherever. So usually I don't take it, but if you're still wanting to take some beach photos while out just sunbathing, the iPhone is a really good option. Also, when you go into a public pool, sometimes they don't allow you to bring a big camera, so taking pictures with the iPhone is actually a good option. So for that, the iPhone is really good, and the better the camera gets, the more I can actually leave my bigger camera at home and don't expose it to risk of being stolen or just draw too much attention or always have to be afraid that somebody comes and interrupts us with our shoot. So now that we got all the good features of the new camera out of the way that everybody's been talking about anyway, let's talk about the bad things. So, like I already said, the 50mm equivalent lens isn't really the best quality you can get. I already found that on the XS Max, but I also found that on the 11 Pro, that when you zoom in, you get this weird pixelation on the skin. It also seems to be applying a little bit of noise reduction or skin smoothing to it, and it's kind of fine if you're not zooming in and if you're just watching it on a phone, but if you blow it up on a larger screen on your computer, the results just get horrible. And that really hasn't changed. It has, however, changed on the 28mm lens. Even when zooming in and looking at it on a big screen and really trying to pixel peep, the results are amazing and you got so much more quality than on the 50mm. So for me, obviously the portrait function of the wide angle lens is the way to go. But we tried it out on our last shoot, and unfortunately, basically 9 out of 10 pictures had mistakes in them. So the software really couldn't keep up when it came to the algorithm of producing the fake bokeh in the background, and especially when there were some holes in it where the software couldn't really distinguish between the background and the foreground, there were a lot of mistakes when looking at the pictures on the computer. On Instagram, sometimes you can't see him, but if you look at him a little bit closer, there were so many mistakes between her arms or just randomly when there were some holes in the picture, or sometimes her one arm was completely blurred out into the bokeh and her other arm was completely sharp. And even on the most images where mostly everything worked okay, there were still some random mistakes, like on her hand where everything was blurred out and smudgy, and that I really didn't like. So if you're just out and taking the snapshot, because that is one big advantage of the iPhone, because sometimes the iPhone is the camera you want to grab to just snap something real quick and you don't have time to grab your bigger camera. But if 9 out of 10 pictures have really bad mistakes in them, that kind of ruins the fun. So the next thing about the iPhone is always the dynamic range. And when we compared it last year to our bigger camera, we were actually surprised that the iPhone a lot of times had way better dynamic range than our way more expensive camera. And by the way, we're going to do the same test again, testing it against a professional camera on next Monday's episode of Model Shoot Monday, so make sure to subscribe. But anyway, so when it works, the HDR function is really great, but we had a lot of scenarios where the algorithm just couldn't keep up. So we were just snapping 2 pictures. One, the sky was completely blown out, and on the very next picture, it was completely blue, almost like it was completely painted into the sky. And sometimes, and that was a little bit more subtle, it couldn't really handle the skin tones. For example, in some pictures, her stomach was completely white, where her head was completely dark. Completely? And you could also see it in the sky that there was some weird line where maybe the camera thought the horizon would be, but it didn't really work a lot of the times, and that completely ruined the skin tones in a lot of the images we took. Granted, the HDR function you can actually switch off, so that is one feature that you can control. So maybe that is the only little pro thing about the camera so far. But again, when you're not having this access to the smart dynamic range, then where's kind of the point? Because then the pictures look a really lot less professional than with the smart HDR function enabled. So with the 28mm, the quality is amazing when the algorithm and the software works, but most of the times for us it didn't. It felt kind of snappy, but again, it produced a lot of mistakes in the HDR department as well in the bokeh department. So that's kind of a drawback. So let's talk about the ultra wide angle lens. As I was already saying, we're mostly shooting portraits, and of course you can make a point that an ultra wide angle lens isn't used to shooting portraits, and I definitely give you credit for that, but it also makes for some really cool angles when utilizing it, like this one we shot in the desert, for example, which was shot on the EOS R, and now we kind of try to reproduce these images with the iPhone 11 Pro, and something really weird happened, and that is the sharpness distribution of the images. For some reason, a lot of the things in the foreground were completely sharp, a lot of things in the background were completely sharp, but for some reason her face was always kind of blurry. And I don't really know what happened there because she didn't really move, but I could reproduce this in a lot of images where a lot of the image was sharp, but her face just wasn't. And I really don't know what happened. But in general, the quality is definitely way lesser than of the other cameras, so keep that in mind when shooting portraits, landscape, or whatever you want to shoot. Again, I'm still a big fan of the ultra wide lens, but it's definitely not as pro as you would wish for. Let's talk about another thing, and that is the auto white balance, because this one really messed up a lot. Especially when she was wearing a white shirt, the camera introduced a lot of blue tint into it, which of course in Lightroom you can get rid of, but keep that in mind that the white balance was off a lot of the times. And maybe that has to do with the smart HDR function again, but in general the auto white balance wasn't really on point. And that brings me to my another point, is that it doesn't shoot RAW. So you introduce a device that is called Pro, but you're really limited when it comes to your options. And the iPhone can shoot RAW when you shoot it in other third-party apps like Lightroom, but when shooting in your native app and using the bokeh or portrait mode effect, you really can't. And that is kind of a bummer because the device is called Pro and you literally have no ability to change anything when using the portrait mode. Of course, you can just lower the light a little or increase it, but other than that, there's hardly anything you can change, like white balance, aperture, shutter, or pretty much anything that you would expect from a Pro device. Okay, so I think we talked enough about the photography side of the camera. Let's talk about the video function. And we were shooting mostly in 4K 60, and that is really amazing and I really like it. And I was pretty amazed by the quality at first. But then when looking at it closer, we had the same problems that the algorithm really messed up a lot of the times. So number one, and I say that again, you really don't have any options to customize anything. You can't set your exposure, you can't set your aperture, and you can't even turn off the smart HDR function as you can for photography. And that one really messed up the most. And sometimes you could really see the camera struggling between trying to expose the sky. So when shooting something like our model shoot Monday, obviously you just cut in and out where it actually works and you have a really nicely exposed sky. But if you're filming an interview or something longer that you really can't cut in and out of, you actually see that the algorithm was completely struggling and it was flickering the entire time in the sky, and it was going back and forth between a completely blown out white sky and something incredibly blue. So keep that in mind. If you're trying to expose something for a longer time, then this one is really a bummer. And yes, I know there's third-party apps like Filmic Pro, for example, but at the time of the recording, the newer version wasn't out yet. And again, I don't think that the smart HDR function works with third-party apps. Again, this is kind of really not pro when it comes to the filmmaking side of things. And not only did the smart HDR function mess up with the sky, it also messed up with the skin tones again, where we had the same results when shooting in photography mode. We also had this weird distribution between colors on her skin, where her face was way too dark and her stomach skin or everything below was way too bright. And then there's another thing. Also the auto white balance. Like I said before, you can't set the white balance, so the camera messes up a lot and it just switches between white balances, which is really annoying if you have longer takes. And here's one thing that it completely messed up most of the time: when she was wearing something white. This is what the white shirt was supposed to look like, and that is what it actually looked like in the video. It has a complete blue tint to it, there's also no brightness in it, and it really doesn't look natural and it's completely messed up. So what I think the camera does is that it's trying to use its HDR function, and it thought that the white shirt was the sky and tried to bring all the highlights down, introduce a little bit of blue, so you get this natural feeling of a natural blue sky, but it obviously couldn't distinguish between the real sky and her shirt, so that was a real bummer. And if you wouldn't edit this video, I don't think you can actually use it, because that just looks horrible. Probably the thing that annoys me the most is that they call their device Pro, but as a pro I want to have a manual and complete control over my camera settings when doing photography as well as video. And you don't have any options whatsoever. One thing, and that is obviously not really the fault of the iPhone, because it's still an iPhone with a really small sensor, is it's really crappy at low light. When we were shooting video and there was still a lot of light out there, it was introducing a lot of noise up to the point where it was hardly usable, and when the sun set completely, you could totally forget to shoot video at all. Okay, so what's our verdict of the new iPhone 11 Pro Max camera? If they wouldn't have called it Pro, I would probably say, wow, amazing camera for all the consumers out there. But if you call your device Pro, which is kind of annoying because they've been doing this lately with the iPad, with the MacBook Pro, and they always have a dedicated consumer option. They have the iPhone 11, they have the MacBooks, they have the regular iPads. So maybe if you're just releasing a product that is called Pro, maybe give the Pros a little bit more features. So in general, we really like the camera. So for 90% of the people out there, it's probably one of the best cameras in any smartphones today. But it also messes up a lot. So if you really want to use it professionally in some kind of capacity, if you like to vlog, if you like to shoot interviews with it, beware that the camera is messing up a lot. So being able to rely on a camera on the iPhone, I don't think that's up to date a good idea. But in general, for most people, it's an amazing camera and probably worth buying. So I hope you liked this video, so smash the like button and hit the notification bell after you subscribe to see more videos about cameras, filmmaking, about the iPhone 11 Pro, because we're not done with it yet. And I'll see you on the next one.